The civilization of ancient Egypt endured for more than 3,000 years, sustained by the predictable bounty of a single river. The annual flooding of the Nile was the engine of their society, depositing rich, fertile silt that made agriculture possible in an otherwise arid land. This agricultural wealth was the foundation of their monumental architecture and their complex religious beliefs. And at the heart of it all was food. Before we deep dive into the history, my name is Boris, and I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what was the best part of your day? Feel free to share it in the comments below. And if you find comfort or curiosity in these calm history journeys, consider giving the video a like and maybe even subscribing for more. Now, settle in. Let's drift gently into the past. We know so much about their diet, not just from texts, but from the incredible preservation found within their tombs. They provisioned the afterlife with the same foods that sustained them in life, leaving behind a culinary roadmap for archaeologists. From loaves of bread and jars of beer to mummified ducks and containers of wine, the Egyptians left behind a feast of evidence. This evidence tells a story of two starkly different worlds, one of lavish feasts and endless variety, and another of simple survival, both unfolding along the banks of the Nile. Before exploring the divergent diets of the rich and poor, we must first understand the bedrock of Egyptian society, the inseparable duo of bread and beer. These were not just food and drink. They were the cornerstones of the economy, the primary source of calories, and a cultural touchstone that united every level of society. The standard wage was a food ration, and the words for bread and beer appear in offering formulas meant to sustain souls in the afterlife. The story of bread and beer begins with emmer wheat and barley, hardy cereals perfectly suited to the Nile Valley. After the annual inundation receded, farmers would cast seeds into the damp soil, a cycle of life dictated by the river itself. Once harvested, the grain began its laborious transformation. Emmer wheat was particularly tough. It had to be moistened and pounded with a pestle just to remove the husk. This work typically fell to women. Tomb paintings show rows of women kneeling at heavy, sloped stones called saddle querns, pushing a handstone back and forth to grind the grain into coarse flour. The process was imperfect, and the resulting flour often contained grit from the grinding stones and sand from the desert environment. Studies of mummies have revealed this had a noticeable effect, showing significant wear on their teeth from a lifetime of chewing gritty bread. The baking process itself was surprisingly varied. The simplest breads were unleavened flatbreads cooked on hot stones. However, the Egyptians were also one of the first civilizations to systematically use yeast to leaven their bread. This led to a vast array of breads, with at least 40 different types known from the New Kingdom alone. Baking technology evolved from heavy pottery molds in the Old Kingdom to large, cylindrical clay ovens by the New Kingdom, similar to a modern tandoor. Loaves could be round, oval, triangular, or even shaped like animals for offerings. Just as important as bread was its liquid counterpart, beer. Egyptian beer, or henket, was fundamentally different from what we know today. It was thick, nutritious, and cloudy, more like a thin gruel. With a low alcohol content, it was a primary source of calories and vitamins consumed by men, women, and children. Crucially, the brewing process rendered the water safe to drink, a vital benefit when the Nile could be contaminated. Bakeries and breweries were often located together as they relied on the same core ingredients. One common method involved lightly baking a rich, yeasty beer bread, crumbling it into a vat with water and allowing it to ferment. The resulting liquid was then strained and stored in pottery jars. This was the beverage that fueled the empire. Laborers who built the Great Pyramids at Giza received daily rations that included several liters of beer. While bread and beer formed the universal foundation of the Egyptian diet, the daily reality for the vast majority, the farmers and laborers, was a world away from the banquets of the elite. Theirs was a diet built on simplicity and repetition, designed to provide the energy for a life of hard physical labor. The core of their diet consisted of bread, beer, and a few key vegetables, most importantly onions, garlic, and leeks. These were not just flavorings, but a substantial part of the meal. The Greek historian Herodotus noted that inscriptions on the Great Pyramid supposedly recorded the vast quantities of radishes, onions, and garlic consumed by the workers. A typical breakfast for a laborer might consist of coarse bread, a cup of beer, and a few raw onions. Legumes like lentils, chickpeas, and fava beans were another critical source of protein, often stewed into a thick porridge. For animal protein, the great equalizer was the Nile. The river teemed with fish like tilapia, mullet, and catfish, which provided the most regular and accessible source of protein for common people. Since fresh fish spoils quickly in the heat, the Egyptians developed effective preservation techniques. The most common method was salting and sun-drying, creating a product that could be stored for months. Meat, however, was an extreme rarity for the common Egyptian, a luxury reserved for special occasions and religious festivals. Domesticated animals like sheep, goats, and pigs were too valuable to be consumed regularly by the families who raised them. While there is evidence that the pyramid builders received daily rations of meat to sustain their intensive labor, this was an exception, not the standard for the typical farmer. The diet of the poor was monotonous, but it was efficient, sustainable, and deeply connected to the river that gave them life. It was a largely plant-based diet supplemented by fish, built around the power of bread and beer. If the commoner's diet was a study in survival, the diet of the pharaoh, nobility, and high priests was a performance of wealth and power. Their tables showcased a staggering variety of foods, a culinary world that declared their high status. Banquets were elaborate affairs where guests were seated according to rank and served by attendants. The most significant difference was the consumption of meat. While a peasant might taste meat only a few times a year, the wealthy ate it regularly. Beef was the ultimate luxury, a symbol of wealth due to the vast tracts of valuable land required for cattle grazing. Choice cuts were common offerings to the gods, and at banquets, roasted oxen were served as a display of immense riches. Beyond beef, the elite enjoyed mutton, goat, and a wide range of wild game, including gazelle and antelope. Poultry was also consumed in enormous quantities. The rich had staff to raise domesticated flocks of ducks, geese, and pigeons. There is even evidence of the practice of force-feeding geese and ducks to fatten them, a technique depicted in tombs dating back to around 2500 BC. When Howard Carter opened Tutankhamun's tomb, he found carefully prepared and preserved ducks, ready for the king's eternal feast. The beverage of choice for the elite was another clear status symbol: wine. While beer was for the masses, wine was for the gods and kings. The Nile Delta was well suited for grape cultivation, and tomb walls depict the entire process of viticulture, from harvesting to stomping grapes in large vats. The resulting wine was sealed in clay amphorae that were often meticulously labeled with the vineyard, year, and vintner, much like a modern wine label. Both red and white wine were found in Tutankhamun's tomb, demonstrating a sophisticated palate. The elite also had access to a much wider array of fruits, vegetables, and, perhaps most importantly, imported spices. Seasonings like cumin and coriander added complex flavors to their stews, while more exotic spices like cinnamon were expensive imports accessible only to the highest echelons of society. Every meal was a reinforcement of the social hierarchy, a constant reminder of the vast gulf that separated the rulers from the ruled. In a world without sugarcane, sweetness came from nature. For ancient Egyptians, this meant fruit and the liquid gold of honey. For everyone, the most common sweeteners were dates and figs. The Egyptian word for sweet, bena, was also the word for date. Often eaten dried, dates provided a simple dessert for the poor and could be mashed into a paste to sweeten bread. Grapes were also eaten fresh or dried into raisins. The ultimate sweetener, however, was honey. It was a precious and expensive commodity. For the wealthy, honey was the primary sweetener for elaborate cakes and pastries, often mixed with nuts or seeds. One ancient recipe describes making sweet balls from crushed dates, cinnamon, and walnuts, which were then coated in warm honey and rolled in ground almonds. A jar containing traces of honey was even found in Tutankhamun's tomb, a provision for his eternal sweet tooth. The wealthy also enjoyed exotic tastes from their trade networks, such as high-quality imported olive oil and sesame seeds. Food preservation was a universal necessity, but the rich had access to more sophisticated methods for their most prized foods. Victual mummies found in tombs were not just salted cuts of meat. They were elaborately prepared and preserved. Analysis of these meat mummies shows they were treated with animal fats or, in one case, a costly resin from the pistachia plant, a substance also used to embalm high-status humans. From simple dried figs to honey-drenched pastries, the world of sweets and preserved foods reveals the same stark contrast that defined the entire Egyptian diet. The story of what ancient Egyptians ate is a narrative etched into their social fabric, a tale of two culinary worlds nourished by the same river. At its core were bread and beer, the universal staples that fueled an empire. They were the calories that built the pyramids and the offerings that consecrated the tombs. Beyond this shared foundation, however, the diet splits into a stark contrast of survival versus luxury. For most Egyptians, life was a cycle of bread, beer, onions, and fish from the Nile. Theirs was a story of resourcefulness, of a people who thrived on the gifts of their land. In the halls of the elite, a different story unfolded. Here, tables were laden with roasted beef, fattened geese, and fine wines from labeled jars. Their food was a declaration of status, a daily ritual that reinforced the immense gap between them and the millions they ruled. Looking at what the ancient Egyptians ate reveals the very structure of their civilization. It shows how a society can be united by a common source of sustenance while being deeply divided by access to luxury. The Nile provided for all, but what ended up on the plate was a clear reflection of one's place in the world. A tale of two kitchens that is the tale of ancient Egypt itself. If you were fascinated by this journey into the kitchens of ancient Egypt, please like this video and subscribe for more explorations into the ancient world. And let us know in the comments, which ancient civilization's diet are you curious about next? Thank you for watching.